My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today, we are going to be looking at the Taiwan Travelogue, a book by Shuangzi, who just won the International Booker Prize last week. Yang's book, Taiwanese Travelogue, I've had it sitting on my bookshelf for months. I've been wanting to read it. It's a novel about Taiwan. I try and read most books about Taiwan and that come out in English and the popular press. I had this on my list, but it just sat there for months. And then last week, I'm recording this right now at the end of May. Last week on May 19th, 2026, Taiwan Travelogue received the International Booker Award. And I was like, oh snap, I have to read that book that's been sitting on my shelf for so long. I heard about the award on Friday. I read the book on Saturday, Sunday. It took a little bit longer to read as Young's book. It's not super long, but it's not short either. And it was a Memorial Day for us here in America, which meant Monday I was hanging out with friends and doing family stuff. So in a little more than a week since the award has come out, I'm going to write this episode, record it, edit it, and hopefully have it to y'all in just over a week. During that time, I also did an interview for the podcast with a certain Minister of Foreign Affairs. That interview is going to come out in a little while as well. It's a fascinating interview. I'm going to leave you on the edge of your seat without telling you which Minister of Foreign Affairs this is that I had an interview with. All that's to say, lots of interesting stuff going on with the podcast today and in the coming weeks. Let's turn to Taiwan Travelogue and the book's author, Shuangzi. So Yang was born in 1984. She is just a couple of months younger than I am. Her real name, or her name given at birth, is Yang Ruci. Shuangzi is just a pen name. Yang was the elder sister of a pair of twins. She and her younger sister, her Mei, started out writing under the shared pen name of Yang Shuangzi. Shuangzi means something like twin, kind of, or double, or Gemini. It's not normally the word we use in Chinese to describe twins. In fact, when I have seen Shuangzi, this word used, it doesn't normally mean twin, but it's specifically used to refer to Gemini. That is not the generative AI of Google fame, but it refers to the pair of mythological twins now most commonly encountered in horoscopes. The Chinese character for Shuang, when she writes it in simplified Chinese, not traditional. Now, remember Taiwan, they almost always write in traditional Chinese, but it is a character that's commonly used in Japanese kanji. So she's actually using something that kind of looks to the Taiwanese eye almost as if it's coming from China, but actually she's doing it as a way of tipping her hat to her love of Japan and Japanese history. Yang Shuangzi and her sister, so they're twins, and they decided when they were fairly young to start writing together. They adopt this shared pen name. The two of them grew up in Taichung, and their childhood was not very happy. Their parents divorced when they were 5. Mom went off and remarried and started a new family. They were left in the care of their dad and his mother. Dad was not around too much, and by the time they were age 14, that grandmother died. Dad was by this point out of the picture, and the twins had to fend for themselves. They had to work part-time while doing their studies on the side, just as a way to make sure they had enough to live. This, not surprisingly, made the two twins even closer than normal twins are. And in 2009, when they were both 26, little sister was told that she had breast cancer. In February 2015, when they were 31, little sister was informed that she had just 3 to 5 months left to live. And then during this time, the twins are writing. Very little that they have written has been published, but they are experimenting in writing. Little sister dies in June of that year, and Yang Shuangzi now has this name, Twin Yangs, which she is going to keep for herself as partially as a way to honor her sister. In 2016, Yang publishes her first novel. It's a lily novel. This term in Chinese is 白鹤小说, literally lily novel, but it refers to a novel where there's a component of sexual interest between two women. In 2020, Yang gets married. She's a lesbian, And she also publishes this book, Taiwan Travelogue. So it's a very good year for her. The novel is translated into English a couple of years later, and in 2026, it wins the International Booker Award. And I think that's a good place to transition to talking about the actual novel itself. So Taiwan Travelogue is told from the perspective of Aoyama Chizuko. This is a fictional Japanese writer, not that she's writing fiction, but she's made up. Aoyama Chizuko. Aoyama Chizuko, she's from Nagasaki. This story takes place in 1938, a time when Taiwan is a colony of Japan, arguably Japan's first colony. Japan took Okinawa and the Ryukyu Islands in the 1870s. Around that same time, it takes Hokkaido, but those are both still Japanese territory. Taiwan is the first territory that Japan snatches that today is not part of Japan and is acknowledged by most in the world to not be Japanese. Japan takes Taiwan in 1895 as a part of the Sino-Japanese War. In 1894, Japan and Qing China are fighting over Korea, over Manchuria, stuff that has nothing to do with Taiwan. But when the Qing loses, they are wheeling and dealing, trying to figure out how they can make things right. The Japanese are very insistent. They want Taiwan. Qing China gives away Taiwan to the Japanese, and it's not going to return to Chinese control until 1945. So by 1938, when this novel takes place, Taiwan is thoroughly integrated into the Japanese empire. Initially, when Japan colonized Taiwan, there was some resistance, but Taiwan became very Japanese. One thing I always say about Taiwan is it has much of what I love about Japan and few of the things that I hate about Japan, and much of what I love about China and few of the things that I hate about China. That's the influence of Japanese colonialism in Taiwan. Lots of the education system is at this time in 1938 is in Japanese, both for the Japanese colonialists who've come from metropolitan Japan, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagasaki. They've come to colonize the island. Those people and their children are being educated in Japanese. But a lot of the education system for the Taiwanese folks, particularly the Taiwanese elite who are part of this up-and-coming class who want to be in colonial officialdom, they're educating their children in Japanese as well. So this novel begins in 1938. Aoyama Chizuko is a Japanese woman who comes from a fairly upper-class Japanese family based in Nagasaki. She arrives in Taiwan. She's invited there because she's this important Japanese writer. Lots of places in Taiwan want someone from the Japanese mainland, that is the imperial mother country, to come and talk to them about writing and different things. Aoyama Chizuko is toured all around Taiwan, mostly by a female translator who becomes the second most important character, arguably the most important character in the novel. She is mostly called Chi-chan in the novel. That's her Japanese name. She's a Taiwanese woman who is the daughter of a prominent family, but she's also the daughter of the concubine of this prominent family, not the daughter of the main wife, so she has a black mark on her. The pair of them go around Taiwan with Aoyama Chizuko making speeches about her writing to civic groups, to schools, to a bunch of different other things. But much of the novel is about them eating Taiwanese food. Aoyama Chizuko really wants Taiwanese food, and initially she's not getting it. People just want to serve her Japanese food that maybe has some Taiwanese influence. But a lot of this novel is them eating, and Aoyama Chizuko learning how cool Taiwan is through its food. And as she learns about Taiwan, they talk about what it means to be Taiwanese, what it means to be Japanese, and what it means to be a Taiwanese citizen of the Japanese Empire and the tensions therein. They also talk a lot about their own relationship, the relationship between these two women, Aoyama Chizuko and Chi-chan. A couple of things I want to point out about this novel. First, This novel is focused on imperialism. It's clearly a post-colonial novel, something that was highlighted by the Booker Award Committee. Natasha Brown, who is the chair of this year's prize jury, said in a news conference that Taiwan Travelogue, quote, pulls off an incredible double feat. It succeeds both as a romance and as an incisive post-colonial novel. I think that is true. I think this is definitely a post-colonial novel. I'm less sure that it's a romance, but it's definitely a post-colonial novel. But I have some questions as to what the empire in the story is. Which empire is it? So if you were to ask Natasha Brown, who's not just a member of the Booker Prize Award jury, but she is also a fairly successful British novelist. If you were to ask Natasha Brown, what is the empire in the story? I think she would say, duh, Japan is the empire. This is clearly a critique of Japan. But I'm not so sure that this novel is only about critiquing the Japanese empire. Certainly, this novel does do that. It does criticize the Japanese empire and the way that the Taiwanese were treated. There are lots of points where this is clear. Early in the novel, Chi-chan is not just Aoyama Chizuko's translator, but by this point is fast becoming a sort of friend, or at least that's how Aoyama Chizuko perceives it. They get to somewhere where Aoyama Chizuko is going to speak, some sort of event. And the servant yells at Chi-chan. He yells at her to clean the woman's shoes and do this degraded servant work. I'll read the passage. Oi, Ozan, came a clipped, low voice from the shoe cupboards behind us. You're the personal assistant, yes? Then I'll leave Aoyama-sensei's shoes for you to clean. What? I stopped walking and turned back. A middle-aged man who hadn't even ranked high enough to introduce himself to me was lording over Chi-chan. There's mud here and here, see? You can manage a simple task like this, no? The impudence! I marched over. O-san is my interpreter. Ah, Aoyama-sensei, Please don't make such unreasonable request of my interpreter. I took Chi-chan by the arm and tugged her close to me. So this novel is definitely your typical post-colonial criticism of imperialism. But I think there's another layer there that you could miss if you're not looking closely enough. There's an interesting parallel where you can see the relationship between Japan and Taiwan as mirroring the relationship between China and Taiwan. I mentioned that Japan colonized Taiwan from 1895 to 1945. What happened after that? Taiwan was given back to China. But who was China? At this time, the China that was recognized was Chiang Kai-shek and his merry band of corrupt officials known as the KMT. They came over, and the island was given to them, and these folks mistreated Taiwan quite severely. And the kind of discrimination that you saw in that passage that I just read happened repeatedly. The Chinese looked down on the Taiwanese. They forced them to do menial labor. They tried to exclude them from jobs. When I was studying in Taiwan in 2013 and 2014, there were a lot of teachers from families born in Taiwan who were, I'm going to use the word ethnic. It's not quite right, but it's the best I can do in English. These teachers were ethnically Taiwanese. Their families had been in Taiwan for several hundred years. But all of the top-level teachers, and I was at the top level at that time, the top-level teachers were largely Chinese. They were mostly people who had been born in Taiwan, but their mothers and fathers, particularly their fathers, had not been born in Taiwan. They had been born in China. And the reason for that was in the 1960s, 1970s, when these teachers came into their teaching career, they had very strict requirements on what kind of accent you could have. You had to have a perfect Mandarin accent, a perfect North Chinese accent to be allowed to teach foreigners Chinese, which of course effectively excluded almost all people who were ethnically Taiwanese. So this kind of discrimination happened in 1945, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, not so much today, but it was most definitely there. And I think that's an interesting parallel to observe. So Aoyama Chizuko doesn't speak any form of Chinese. She only speaks and reads Japanese. And in Taiwan at the time, and this is historically correct, Yang got this right. Totally. Yang is someone who is not just a novelist, but she's also a thoroughly good historian. So Japanese at the time in 1938 was referred to as the national language. So when you read this book, if you see the national language, what they're talking about is Japanese. In Chinese, you would say 国语. In Japanese, the kanji are the exact same, but it's kokugo. But they're the same word, same kanji, just different pronunciations. One's Japanese, one's Chinese. That word, national language, is the word that the KMT used to refer to Mandarin when they took over the island in 1945. So in bringing so much discussion of this national language, there is automatically, by the use of this word, which means one thing in 1938 Japanese colonial context, and that everyone in Taiwan knows about, but it means something quite different in 1950s Taiwan that everybody reading this text will know about. There is this kind of attempt, I think, to create a parallel between Japanese colonization of Taiwan and KMT colonization of Taiwan. Of course, the KMT would not acknowledge at the time that was colonization. And I think most folks in the KMT would be unhappy with my use of the term colonization, but I think it's a fair term. And I also think that Yang here is someone who is aware of that. Yang Shuangzi is a person who started out as a supporter of the KMT. She was born on a military base, and the military is very closely aligned traditionally with the KMT. But as she grew up, she increasingly turned towards the Green Party, that is the pro-independence DPP grouping. So I think that this criticism of the KMT and Chinese colonialization of Taiwan post-1945 is something that's there. I think the use of the term 国语 or national language is the clearest parallel that you have there. But there are some other parallels. The Taiwanese are referred to in the English translation as islander, and the Japanese are referred to as mainlanders in the English version. That's the translator's term. When people talk about Chinese mainlanders in English, the word is 大陆人. In the novel, the Chinese word to refer to the Japanese as mainlanders is not the same thing when we say mainland China. It's not 大陆人, it's 内地人. Still, I think there's this interesting parallel that's going on there. The word to refer to Taiwanese islanders in this novel is 本岛人, people from this island. When the KMT colonized Taiwan, they referred to the Taiwanese as 本省人, people from this province. So again, it's not exactly the same, but there's a parallel going on there. All of that is to say that in this novel, which you can see as a post-colonial critique of Japan, there is also a shaded, kind of hidden critique of KMT imperialism. So this novel is about imperialism, but it's also about women. The narrator makes it very clear that imperialism and her critique of it is connected to a critique of misogyny. Yang seems to be making the argument that women are themselves colonized by men in this novel. She has this long passage talking about empire, and then all of a sudden she connects it to gender. So I'm going to just quote a bit of it. The Empire's southern expansion movement and national spirit mobilization movement had taken shape as imperial assimilation movements here in the colonies. Were they not, in essence, brute acts of erasing the distinctions of individual cultures? I couldn't help but feel resistance and disgust whenever I considered the matter seriously. And then all of a sudden she turns to talking about gender. In the face of war, there is no distinction between man and woman. This was a tune that I had heard some sing. I was unconvinced. It would have been more accurate to say, when it comes to hurdles faced by women, there's no distinction between mainland and islander. So, in talking about imperialism, she's saying that whether or not you're from Japan or you're from Taiwan, women are colonized. This is something you see frequently throughout the novel, this linking of gender and colonialism. I mentioned earlier that Young is a lesbian, and I read this discussion of gender as a lesbian critique of men overall. Part of the plot of the novel revolves around Chi-chan's marriage. Chi-chan is getting pushed into a marriage that she doesn't want for financial reasons, and she's resigned to it, and she points out that this is the fate of most women in the world. Aoyama Chizuko tries to get Chi-chan to get her to reject this marriage. At one point, she asks Chi-chan to go live in Nagasaki with her, but Chi-chan won't do it. Natasha Brown at the Booker Committee referred to this as a romance, as I mentioned before. I didn't see any point where I would call this a romance. These two characters don't aim to me to have a sexual relationship. At least I didn't see that implied. Maybe I'm missing it, but I think there's still a clear sense that Aoyama Chizuko wants to be more than just friends in this novel. Even if it's never explicit, I think it's implied. I think a final question I had hanging over this novel is, what's up with Nagasaki? Aoyama Chizuko goes from her family in Nagasaki to Taiwan. She spends a year in Taiwan exploring Taiwan with Chi-chan. Then does she go back to Nagasaki in 1939, 1938, whatever? Does she live in Nagasaki until 1945? Is she there when the bomb falls? That was something that I don't think is ever answered. But it's a question that I think you've got to ask. Is this novel itself a war critique? Obviously, it's critiquing empire. It's critiquing gender. It would make sense that there is a war critique. In fact, it's interesting that when you look at the Chinese version of the novel, the copy that I found has Aoyama Chizuko as one of the authors. It's listed, the authors are listed Aoyama Chizuko and Yang Shuangzi, at least in the English translation. And I mostly read the English translation. I cross-checked things with the Chinese translation some. But at least with the English translation, there wasn't a thing where it said, oh, Yang Shuangzi, found this book and I'm republishing it, as if she's pretending to just not be writing the book, but is just publishing something. But there is this question of what happens to Aoyama Chizuko, and how does this novel, which is actually appearing to be a travelogue, how does it get into her hands? That's something that lingers over the book and is never really answered. And I think that's a pretty good place to end it. All in all, this is a pretty interesting novel. It talks about gender, sexuality, empire, war, all hot topics in literature today. The book is Taiwan Travelogue by Yang Shuangzi. Take a look at it. It's available all over the place now that it's got the big Booker Award behind it. I am going to leave this episode. Hopefully, I'm going to drop this episode a little bit more than a week after the Booker Prize Committee awarded her that big prize. Until the next time, my name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.